Hello, good morning. Today, our guest Professor Priyaranja Jha. Hello, Professor Jha. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm great, and we're going to be discussing your paper on colonialism in India. And this paper is titled The Impact of Colonial Institutions on Economic Growth and Development in India, Evidence from Night Lights Data. Professor Jha, why are night lights a proxy for economic development?
Okay. It has been found that when your standard of living improves as you get richer, you use more lights. So that's kind of the basic idea. You consume more electricity and you use more lights in the evenings. And people have found a high correlation between the usage of lights per capita and GDP per capita in areas or for geographical units for which you have data on both. And therefore, it has become a good proxy for GDP per capita for levels of aggregation and in non-technical terms, what it would mean is, say, subnational level, if you want to look at the standard of living at a district level or village level for which you do not have data on per capita income, then you could use night lights per capita as a proxy for per capita income for those units. That's roughly the idea.
Professor Jha, in your paper, you talk about princely states and native states. What's the difference?
Oh, they are the same. So there was some areas of India which were under the direct British rule. So that's one category. And the other one is which were kind of autonomous. They were ruled by local princes and kings. And so sometimes we call them princely states and sometimes native states. They're kind of the same. So the distinction that we make is between areas which were directly ruled by the British and indirectly ruled. And indirectly ruled areas are kind of princely states or native states.
So what influenced the decision of the British to implement direct rule in some areas and indirect rule in other areas?
Yeah, so what we are doing is we are looking at the impact of this colonial institution or legacy on current development. So we do not have data on their levels of development during British time. So we are looking in 1990s using nightlights data. And what we find is that the areas which were under direct British rule, they are doing much worse in terms of night lights per capita, which means that their level of development is less compared to areas which were ruled by the kings and princes. So that's our basic finding.
Yes, and in your article, you quoted the famous study published by Lakshmi Iyer. Her study is often cited by scholars. What's the difference between your study and her study?
Yeah, so the main question is kind of the same, whether direct British rule had a different effect than say indirectly ruled areas. So the key difference is that she uses different proxies for development. She does not have an overall measure of development. So ideally, it is per capita income. She talks about it in the paper. But in the absence of that, she uses things like agricultural investment and agricultural productivity in those areas and so on. And she also looks at the impact of a direct British rule on investment in infrastructure and so on. So I would say the key difference is that we are using a measure of overall development and which is night lights per capita, and she uses some other measures which try to capture some aspects of development, but not overall development.
In your paper, you argued that in areas under direct British rule, literacy rates were higher. Why was that the case?
Yes, so that is true. The literacy rate was higher in directly ruled areas, and we do not go into explanation as to why in the paper, but my conjecture is that uh, from limited knowledge of history, that British were trying to spread education because they needed some workers to be literate or somewhat educated so that they can do clerical jobs for them. So British hired a lot of clerks and things like that, some officials who could do work for them. And so that was probably the main motivation in spreading education. Another thing is not a direct impact of the British, but something that we talk about in the paper is the role of missionaries. So Catholic and Protestant missionaries came to India and they spread education, and their mission was different. They just wanted probably to spread education. And their activities were also more in the directly ruled areas than in the areas ruled by local princes and kings. So that may have accounted for better literacy rates in directly ruled areas.
Great. I was just about to ask you about the role of religion in either stimulating or hindering development in India. Catholic missionaries, were they successful?
Well, so missionaries were successful in spreading education, not so much in religion, because only 2% of India is Christian. So only 2% of the population is Christian. Okay, so missionaries, I mean, I don't know whether to call that success, and I'm not sure how much of that can be accounted for by missionary activities, because Christianity has been in India for a long time, over 1500 years. So I don't know how successful they were in spreading their religion, but they were successful in spreading education, establishing learning center schools and so on. So
And
yeah.
and what about Protestants?
Yeah, I think there's evidence for that also. So, I mean, both these activities, Catholic missionary activity and Protestant missionary activities, they are positively correlated with the literacy rate in those areas. So wherever they have their missions, those areas tend to have better literacy. Yes.
And so you also examine physical infrastructure and outcomes like health, etc. Could you shed
Mhm.
some more light on these variables for us?
Yes, so yeah, we look at two key measures of physical infrastructure. One is railroads or railways per capita, and the other one is roads per capita. And interestingly, we find that in the British areas, you have better railway infrastructure. So railroads per capita is higher in British areas, and that is probably because British constructed railways in their areas, and they wanted to ship goods from the interior to the ports, and also for mobilizing troops if they wanted to crush any rebellion. So they were spreading railways, and so you still find a difference, that is, those areas have better rail way per capita, but or railroads per capita. But we looked at roads per capita, and there we found the opposite. It is the indirectly ruled areas which have better roads per capita. Now, as far as health is concerned, a year finds that British areas have less, say, health clinics per capita. And so we did not replicate it. We would find the same thing, but we did find some evidence of slightly higher infant mortality in directly ruled areas than indirectly ruled areas. So there's some evidence of higher infant mortality. So worse health outcomes in directly ruled areas compared to indirectly ruled areas.
Now we're going to talk about the land tenure systems. In your paper, you contend that a major reason for the disparities between indirect rule areas and direct rule areas is the nature of the land tenure system. Could you describe it for us?
Yes, so British had three different types of land tenure system, and so these are basically the way they collected land revenue. Okay, so one is called landlord-based system or zamindari system, where these zamindars or landlords were responsible for paying a fixed amount of revenue to the British, and they were given a larger tract of land over which they had rights to collect revenue, and then they were free to collect as much revenue as they wanted. So other than the fixed revenue that they had to give to the British, there was no other control or anything. They had flexibility. And then you had a system called which is a peasant-based revenue system where peasants were directly responsible for paying revenue to the British. And then there was an intermediate system which was kind of village based, where the village was responsible. So these were three different types of revenue collection systems, also called land tenure systems. And what we find is that the British area, which had landlord-based zamindari, they are the ones which are doing really badly. And you have landlord-based and peasant-based system under indirect rule as well, but there the differences in development are not much. Okay, and then you have these peasant-based systems under direct rule. They are also not doing bad. So the other three categories are kind of directly ruled areas under landlord-based system are the ones which are doing the worst.
Interesting. The peasant systems, why didn't those systems do worse?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't know exactly why, but conjecture is that since they were directly in touch with the British, they could ask for exemption of their payments if there was a drought or something like that, and maybe British administrators were more responsive to their needs during times of drought and so on, and landlords may have been more exploitative, but that is just a conjecture. Yeah.
Professor Yao, who were the landlords? Where were they from in India? Were they native Indians in the elite? Were these people British? Who were they?
Yes, all of them were native. So there were very few British in India, actually. Even at the peak of their rule, I don't think the British population in India exceeded 150,000 or something in a massive country. Were all local, and these were probably the people who already had land. So they were kind of large landowners, and in addition to their own land, they were given the right to collect from whole of other peasants as well. So they were all local, and they tended to be from the upper caste. You know, India has caste system, and so they were kind of you can say they were rural elites, pretty much.
And well, I know that this is not the focus of your study, but do you plan to do a follow-up study to examine the families who were involved? I think that would be interesting.
You mean landlords?
Yes, the families and their descendants. So are these people still wealthy today? I think that would be interesting. A follow-up
Yeah,
study.
they are still wealthy. They are upper caste, and they are still wealthy. There's no question. And they actually were the ones who resisted land reforms, because India undertook massive land reforms after independence. And these guys were the ones which were who were opposed to land reforms. And in some states, so there's tremendous variation in the extent of land reform across different states in India. And in some states, these guys were politically influential as well. And so they were able to slow down the process of reforms in states like Bihar and UP, which are kind of some of the poorest states. But yeah, I mean, we can think about doing more stuff on it. But my guess is that they are still the rural elites, these people and their descendants. They may not have their descendants may not be living in villages anymore because they were rich, so they could afford to educate their children. So they may be outside now. But yes, I think they were their descendants would be very rich.
But you know, Professor, yeah, I am still interested in the peasants because usually intuitively would assume that the system managed by peasants would do worse because they're poorer and might have lower levels of human capital. So I'm wondering what's really going on with those people and how did it improve their living standards after?
Yeah. So I mean, so you're talking about land tenure institutions?
Yeah, and and its relationship to
Yeah.
the pedantry.
Yeah. So I mean, if was directly responsible for paying land revenue to the British, I mean, they paid a fixed amount to the British, and they could keep the rest, right? So they had an incentive to work harder or make improvements to their land because they knew that whatever extra they produce, they can keep it to themselves. But they didn't have that security in the landlord-based areas because there the landlords could exploit them. They could increase the amount that the landlords were collecting from them because the landlords had to give a fixed amount to the British, but they could keep the rest. So the landlords had an incentive in exploiting the peasants. So that's what we think is probably responsible for landlord areas being more backward. There, the peasants did not have incentives to make improvements to their land or to work harder and so on. So, yeah.
Professor, yeah, I think that this is quite fascinating, and you're right. Though the disparity in economic development across directly and indirectly ruled districts has decreased over time since 1993 till 2019, the gap is still significantly large, 18 to 21%, and persists even after including other controls such as educational attainment, health, and physical infrastructure.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
Yeah. So it is going down. You know, India undertook a program of massive liberalization starting in early 90s. And since then, the gap has been narrowing. The importance of agriculture in overall economy is going down. So that is partly the reason why the gap is narrowing, because the gap was mostly in agricultural terms. So as India is urbanizing more and industrializing more, or the economy is shifting from agriculture towards industries and services, I think that gap is narrowing. And I mean, I should tell you something, we haven't talked about it. So our headline number was 40% difference in lives per capita, and it came down to 20%. But these numbers look very large, but if you translate them into per capita GDP, it's like 0.3 of that. So earlier it would be say 8-9% difference in the level of per capita GDP, and now it has come down to 4-5%. So it's not that big if you look at it in terms of per capita GDP.
Professor, yeah, your work is really interested in exploring the effects of trade, labor, and other economic variables. This article is not about trade liberalization in India, but you have written extensively on the topic. Would you say that trade liberalization has benefited Indians?
I think trade liberalization has benefited India. I mean, India has experienced tremendous GDP growth over the last 20 years or 25 years or so. And I think trade has contributed to the growth of India. I mean, trade gives you a lot of things. It gives you access to inputs, like you can buy machines and things which you couldn't produce domestically earlier. So it helps you achieve production efficiency. You can import technology from abroad. You can sign a deal with a foreign company to transfer technology to you. and it gives you an export market. There are a lot of things for which domestic demand may not be high. You could export those goods. So yeah, I think overall trade has helped India.
And would you say that certain parts of India were more responsive to trade based on economic systems that were implemented during the colonial era?
That is hard to say. So when you open up the economy to trade, what happens is that mostly trade is in manufacturing goods these days, right? So India exports a lot of manufacturing and imports a lot of manufacturing, even though in India's case, there's a lot of service exports as well. But most trade in the world is two-way trade in manufacturing, different types of manufacturing. So areas which were competing with imports, they kind of had some decline, but areas which were exporting more, they gained more. So it's a complicated thing. I don't think I can answer the question exactly, because I don't know how to go about it. I'll have to think about it, because it is true that the impact of trade is different. It's not the same in all areas of a country. There's a heterogeneous effect depending on industrial composition of the area at the time of opening to trade, whether it's going to be import competing or export, or whether it's going to benefit from importing a lot of foreign inputs and so on. So that's a kind of general answer.
Professor, yeah, I think that this paper is quite fascinating because we can analyze the thesis from multiple angles. So we're talking about land tenure systems and their impacts on long-term development. But to make it a bit clearer for our listeners, land tenure systems made some people rich. Therefore, because some people became wealthier, that put them in a position to access better healthcare, education, and invest in physical infrastructure. Is this what you're saying?
No, so it's actually the opposite. So these landlords who became richer, they were a very small minority, and they became richer at the expense of peasants or something. So it was an exploitative system. So these areas are the ones which are not doing well. Okay, and there may be other reasons, because there's mistrust among people in those areas. It's more hierarchical. These elites kind of dominated the peasants. So these areas are not doing well. So they are the most backward.
No, sir. That was an error. I said landlord. I should have said the tenure system, based on the tenure system, because landlord is specific. Based on the
Right.
tenure system, are some places richer because they made more money, and as a result, they're better able to access healthcare, education, and invest in physical infrastructure.
Yeah, that is possible. So like peasant-based systems, peasant-based revenue collection system, those areas are doing better. And so their peasants had more incentive to make improvements in their land, work harder on their land, and so on. And yes, and they made they had probably better access to health and education. They may have educated their children and so on. And so yeah, so those areas are doing better.
I get the point now. It's quite obvious. The tenure system made peasants more entrepreneurial. Is it fair for me to make this conclusion?
I think so. Yeah, I think it was a better system from the point of view of giving incentives to peasants to make improvements in their land or work harder. In technical terms, we call it residual clement. They were residual clement to the produce of their land. So they had to give a fixed revenue to the British, and they could keep the rest, right? So they were residual clement. Whatever was left was theirs. So if they worked harder and they got more, they could keep it. But they were not sure that they could keep it in the landlord-based areas. So that was the difference. So it was better for incentivizing peasants, the peasant-based system.
All right. Another thesis that I'm going to be sharing, my own thesis, was the landlord-based system less of a free market system?
I won't get into the market issue here because I don't think there was a market for revenue. This was like a government thing. Government was collecting revenue, and one was like more direct way of collecting revenue, and the other one was a more indirect way where you had your agents collecting it in the landlord case. So landlords were the agents of the British, while in the peasant-based system, peasants were directly giving it to the British. So it's not clear to me where the market comes in this discussion.
Well, it depends, because you could look at the landlord like a middleman.
Yes, so they were exactly the middleman, but there was no market. You know, it's like I mean it's like government collecting taxes directly or indirectly. So it's that and that pretty much. Yeah.
You also explained an earlier point a few minutes ago about trust and hierarchy, and I was never really assessing the paper from that angle. I think that this could be an element in your follow-up study.
Yeah. I mean, so you know, we don't put these things in the paper because if you say something, you have to back up with evidence, and these are kind of just conjectures. We don't have evidence to say that there's mistrust among people, which leads to like failure of collective action or whatever, providing public goods and things like that. They cannot agree to build better schools because all these things need cooperation at the local level, right? To have better public schools or better healthcare system or better roads and things, and so they cannot cooperate. There's mistrust among people and so on. So those are possibilities, but yeah, it would be good to do follow up, try to weather some of those things. And,
yeah, it's obvious. I'm really enjoying this paper. I think that we can look at it from multiple angles. I've read quite a few papers on India, but I've never read one explaining the land tenure system. I'm interested in property rights, real estate, and all these factors affect economic growth. So there's a paper on the Caribbean on the internal marketing system in countries like Jamaica and how this system equipped the descendants of slaves to do business in America. And this is one reason why Black people of Caribbean descent are more likely to own property in the United States. So I'm really interested in real estate and property rights.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. But Professor, yeah, other than the land tenure systems, could you, if they exist, but could you shed some light on other arrangements in India in that era?
That differed systematically between directly ruled and indirectly ruled areas?
Yes, any economic policy implemented by the British, whether it be relating to trade or property rights, other than the land tenure system?
Other than that, I don't know. I mean, there's something about forced cultivation of opium, poppy, you know. So that this was in the 19th century, and this is linked to the Indian population in the Caribbean and Mauritius and so on, and Fiji and all also. So maybe they didn't do it in the indirectly ruled areas. So you know, they forced these peasants to grow poppies, and they would give them some money to buy seeds, whatever, and then if the crop failed, they won't be able to pay back their loans, and then they would give them the offer to sign as indentured labor and go to these places, you know, in the Caribbean or in Mauritius or Fiji to be plantation workers. So they would put them on ships and send them to be plantation workers in those areas. And so this was going on in the mid 19th century in some areas of India, like my home state, Bihar, and UP, which is the largest state in India. So a lot of people migrated to these places because they became landless and they didn't have any options. So it was not like slavery where they were captured and put on a ship, but and they were forced in some sense because of circumstances and because of some prior British policies in some sense. And those areas are still poor in India. So yeah, that's one thing I can think of that went on. And the trade policy also was kind of bad. They were kind of forcing India to buy manufactured cotton, which kind of decimated the local cotton industry in India. And so I don't know, I haven't studied about the reach of these policies in indirectly ruled areas, whether they were affected to a similar extent or less. So I'm not really an economic historian. This was just an excursion into this interesting topic. And
Okay. All right. So maybe you're going to venture more into economic history in the future. I think you should. It's really interesting. I like to do research on the drain theory. I've actually written a piece on the topic, but we can I can send you that via email because I'm planning to wrap up. But Professor Yao, speaking to you has been a pleasure, and we'll definitely talk via email. Bye.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.